Well, welcome everybody. It's very nice to have you here listening to the first of a series of conversations between myself, Samantha Graham, and Erfan Daliri. We are proposing to have a series of unusual, uncommon conversations that will allow us to deep dive into the topics of sexism and racism and the relationship between them. And by way of introducing ourselves, Erfan, I might flick to you to let us know who you are and what you're about.
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Erfan Daliri. I am a social change consultant, educator. I work in the areas of anti-racism education, NGO consulting, and I'm passionate about creating a more just, equitable, balanced, peaceful world, and use my skills and expertise in whatever way I can to help people create change in their spaces. I've got a background in community development. I've got a master's in communication for social change, and I had a brief career in spoken word poetry as well, and published a few books of poetry once upon a time. Yeah, you'll get to know a bit more about me over the course of these series, I guess. So I'll keep it brief for the time being, and let Samantha introduce yourself.
Thank you, Erfan. I have witnessed Erfan doing spoken poetry. It's extraordinary. And I'll give you a little bit about my background and then we'll say how we met, perhaps. So I work with leadership teams in the corporate sector, sometimes football teams as well. But my focus is shifting quite a lot, I should say. Basically, my state of mind work was looking at resilience and efficiency and creativity in teams of people, and with a long history, family history, of basically seeing sexism from a very young age, I realized that I needed to shift my programs to take in and even to acknowledge the incredibly sexist nature of the culture that we're working in, whether it's in the corporate sector, schooling, political system, this ubiquitous sense of women being less than. And I just realized that love working with executive leadership teams, corporate teams, a lot of all male environments where I've worked with football teams, but I've been doing a disservice to those women in those teams if I'm not explicitly talking about the gendered differences in their experience, whether it's around stress, anxiety, worry, the mental load, emotional labor. It's very different for women and men in those leadership positions. And just coming back to how we met, Erfan has run an extraordinary festival come conference in Tasmania for a number of years, and he invited me to speak 2 years in a row actually at that gathering. Maybe Erfan, do you want to say a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. At New Kind, so we met at New Kind conference. Can't remember exactly how I came across your work, but someone introduced your work to me, and I was like, yep, we want Samantha at New Kind for sure. New Kind is basically a conference where we bring together speakers and thought leaders from various fields of thought and social change movements to help empower the conference delegates, I guess, to go out into the world and do what they do more effectively. We hosted it in a somewhat of a festival environment, but in a zero waste, plant-based diet, completely drug and alcohol free environment, just so we could showcase what a sustainable event / festival could look like, and so that we could stay aligned with our own environmental kind of like morals in a sense, but the core of it was to empower change makers to become more effective in society. So we would bring in mindfulness coaches like Samantha. We would bring in advocacy trainers from Amnesty. We would bring in permaculture experts to talk about social permaculture, and help people join a couple more dots and to find out where they fit in the grand scheme of social change globally. So yeah, that's how Samantha and I met.
Thank you. And that's probably a really good segue into the context for these conversations. So what we're assuming is sitting behind these conversations is the notion that we're facing an existential crisis, and that human behavior has created this sixth mass extinction that we're currently traversing as a species. And it It also assumes that most people are in denial about the situation, and or subconsciously they're anxious and potentially mourning the loss of a more certain future, one that previous generations had the freedom to enjoy. Erfan does not yet have children. I have a son who's 14, and just witnessing the temperament, the emotions, that background message that these children, teenagers have to live with is definitely influencing my desire to do this work on gender and racism. Also, just to bring in the notion of the operating system that underpins some of the outdated worldviews. The patriarchal worldview that dominates in every nation state is built on foundations basically that are racist and sexist. So we're going to unpack these assumptions and look for similarities and differences between the two, outline major turning points in history that have formalized and concretized these racist and sexist assumptions. And we'll also look at where these beliefs show up in ubiquitous linguistic, cultural, and policy norms, basically perpetuating the pathological behaviors that undermine the ecosystems we need for our very existence. So, Erfan, if you want to comment on any of that before we get into a couple of examples from our own lives.
I'm happy to move into examples. I think you covered that intro context very well. It's basically looking at the intersections of the different injustices across the world so that we can find what's the common thread, what is it at the core of why our planet is, so to speak, falling to pieces socially, economically. So we can't treat symptoms separately. As a qualified physician of society, we have to look at the symptoms and make a diagnosis of what's the underlying cause. And I guess that's at the core of what these conversations are about, is to find what's the underlying cause that society is in the situation that it's in, so that we can apply a systems thinking kind of framework to how do we solve this. So that's a part of it for me as well.
Beautifully said. And something I forgot to mention when I introduced myself was just that idea of how do we get a systems perspective. And you clearly, well, I won't speak for you, but for myself, I stepped out of the corporate world quite early and went and did a master's in human ecology. And so that the relationship between the ecosystems we need to sustain ourselves and all of the social systems, the social, the educational, the political, the legal, that need to fit within that greater context, are what fires me up and makes me so curious about, well, what changes can we make? And so would you like to start, Erfan, with your that experience, your first experience of racism where you just got it?
Well, I really got it. It'll be a different one to what most might expect as an experience of racism, because I like to try and make clear this difference between living within systemic racism and an experience of racism. Because those experiences of racism, those incidents where someone calls you a boat person while they're standing behind you at an ATM, like that's not really systemic racism. That's just like something you just brush off and you turn around and you say, "G'day, mate," in your Ocker, in your most Ocker accent, and that kind of like puts them off. And that's it, really. It wasn't one of those kinds of experiences for me. I experienced many of those moments in my life, but it was a particular memory that I kind of can't really erase anymore from my mind, of when I was in my first year of university. I moved to Brisbane from Townsville for uni, and my family had decided that my sisters were a couple of years younger. As soon as they finish high school, they'll also move to Brisbane to do university in Brisbane with me, so we could all stay together. So my father was applying for jobs and looking to leave his role, which was the director of a particular NGO in Townsville, working in the refugee settlement. And he was applying for jobs all over the place in Brisbane, academic jobs, NGO jobs. And I happened to be in Townsville over the summer holidays, or I think mid-year break or something, while he was preparing to go to Brisbane for a job interview he'd just been called up for. And because my dad also does a lot of outdoor work, he does a lot of welding, building massive sculptures, he'd spent a fair bit of time in the sun leading up to this interview. And, you know, we tan quite easily. I can go up and down 8 shades of brown between winter and summer. And while I was back in Townsville, I happened to walk in on my father with a scrubber and an open bottle of household bleach with the cap open, and he was scrubbing his face with floor bleach. This is a man who survived prison and torture, who's learnt 5 languages, who's got a PhD in education, he's been awarded the Order of Australia Medal for his services to community, and the successful NGO, you know, director of an NGO, supremely accomplished man, with 3 grown children, yet still fully aware that the slightly darker tone of his skin would have an impact on whether or not he got the job. And if you could just, even though he can't become a white, just if you could make it a little bit lighter, it might help him get through the first round of interviews. Just that awareness that he had, and what drove him to do such a thing, is one of those moments where I realized this is so much bigger than just getting teased in primary school. Like, this is something that is all encompassing, and neither one of us had to say anything. Like, he knew that I knew what was going on, and I knew that he knew that I knew, and no one ever spoke about that ever again. Not my mom, not my dad. Everyone knew what happened, but we just kind of left it at that. And that's what it's like living in a systemically racist society. It's an everyday thing. It doesn't require contact with another person for you to know. So that's one of the stories that I used to help elaborate what we mean by systemic racism. It doesn't mean there's racists everywhere. It means there's racism in everything, you know, and that's the difference.
Phew, amazing. Wow.
Yeah.
Goodness me, thank you so much. We'll share a couple of similar stories in each conversation.
Yeah.
My goodness. Wow. Well, I can speak to one of my standout experiences where I wasn't so consciously aware. It was more a subconscious. I couldn't figure it out. It was plain confusing. That's what it was. Night after night in, say, class 5, 6, 7, 8 at school, I'd come home and mum and dad both worked. White, middle class, middle-aged people at that stage, both were doctors. And mum and dad would be working really long, full days. They were old school doctors in as much as they were there to serve people. I mean, they were just so committed to healing people in that really beautiful old-fashioned way. So mum specialised in women's medicine. Dad was into orthopedics. And we'd come home, the 3 kids, and my 2 brothers, one older, one younger, and mum and dad would be sitting around the kitchen table. Mum had been working the entire day, and she was expected to put dinner on the table. And as those, well, there weren't that many women mothers of my age working, actually, not where I grew up. And anyway, she did it. She pulled it off. But then the time would come for clearing the dishes. And I noticed this tension in my own body as the only girl. Am I really going to sit here and pretend to be one of the kids and not lift a hand? Or am I going to get up and fulfill that gendered role of taking the dishes, stacking them in the dishwasher, doing the dishes, helping my mum, who had basically done as much of a day's work as my dad? I just knew he was not going to move. He was a beautiful human being, but he was going to sit there. And my brothers were looking at him, so they were going to sit there. And that was that first taste. And it goes on for years, of course, in those scenarios. And you think, wait, I want to be like them. And so those small influences, I think, can shift our entire identity. You know, I became a tomboy like that because I really did not want to be packaged into that gendered role. Now, I don't want to compare my story with yours. Mine sounds mildly pathetic compared to what you went through.
Not at all.
And yet it's that subconscious chipping away and suggesting that
every single day, right? It's like persistent. These messages that come from family, from media, from colleagues, everyone. It's just I can't imagine how infuriating that I have experience of racism, but I can't fully comprehend what that feels like, to have that happen every single day as well.
And I think for both racism and sexism, there's that constancy and that drip, 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 which just wears your psyche down. And unless you can name it and point to it, it can be exhausting. Is one experience from my perspective. And we'll probably, I'm sure, we'll cover off a lot of those. To name and point to the elements that make up what I like to think of as a headwind that we're just leaning into the whole time. And headwind's great because you can't see it, you can just feel it.
Exactly.
Yeah. So look, I think that's probably us for this first session.
Okay.
Do you want to mention what else we might cover as we go through?
I'm sure we're going to cover lots of different areas. I mean, maybe you can jump in as well with a few of these suggestions. I think the intersectionality, obviously, like that, the intersection of where sexism and feminism kind of cross, and where, you know, the term misogynoir kind of comes in, like the misogyny that women of color specifically experience. So there's misogyny, of course. So like that's one area that we'll look at, because that's really important to be able to parallel different dynamics that play out in one area to the other and help make linkages. So we'll cover that. I don't know, what are some of the ones that are coming up in your mind we're going to do in the next couple of weeks?
I think just looking at the spectrum of action that you can see, just a little subtle racist or sexist joke in the office or on the street, and at the other end, state legislated, you know, lynchings not so long ago, and or partner murder, which is happening once a week.
That's it. Yeah, looking at that spectrum and how that it's not a distinct, clear-cut area of what's acceptable and what's not. It's just like it just bleeds into something else, and before you know it, an inappropriate joke becomes inappropriate touching, becomes sexual harassment, becomes rape, becomes violence. It's just like we've got to recognize that spectrum to work out, well, where can we be most effective? If we think that an inappropriate joke or whatever as a child is separate completely, then we'll continue allowing that mechanism to keep catapulting from one end of the spectrum to the other. So yeah, I think clarifying that it is a spectrum is super powerful to address the issue.
Yeah, beautiful. And we might look at similarities and differences between the two where they're not so similar. And there's some fantastic data that we can draw on in terms of shifts in the self-confidence in terms of sexism between young boys and young girls, and where are those messages coming from, and why is there such a divide between ages 5 and 6, for example? So lots of great things to cover off on, and so
the role of power, that's like just distilling it down to like what's power got to do with sexism and racism, because if you can really like boil it down, and one of the things, if you really boil it down, for me, one of the key elements that's left in that pot is power. That's the thing that's in common. So we can understand power dynamics. That's really at the core of sexism and racism, that, you know, hierarchy of race or the gender constructs, you know, just deconstructing that could be a whole conversation for us. Like, what do we mean by gender constructs? How is gender different to sex? And what's it like to be squeezed into a gender construct? And what happens when you step out of that construct and you behave in a way that society hasn't, you know, deemed socially appropriate? What happens to that, you know, in the workplace, at home, in society, when a woman portrays assertiveness or passion, you know, what are the repercussions? That's super powerful. I found that conversation to be super enlightening with colleagues and clients every day. Yeah,
wonderful. And then there's some interesting stuff in the news around coercive control at the moment. So there's so much for us to draw on.
So yeah, we're going to hope to release one a week from here on, probably on both of our social media channels, LinkedIn, Facebook, whatever. So yeah, wherever you happen to find this, we'll likely put up another one in a week's time, around about the same time of the week. So yeah, stay tuned, and hopefully we get to have this prolonged conversation over a few weeks and get to some solutions.
Indeed. Brilliant. Thanks, Erfan.
Thanks, Sam.
See you all later.
Bye.
Bye.